the discussion on synapse and neurotransmitters, another simple and straightforward topic, and that is reflex. It can be covered at this stage. How important is it for the entrance exams? Well, they can ask some questions related to the reflexes, but not many questions. I've seen some questions in the FMGE exams, but not many in the NEET PG or other entrance exams. Nevertheless, we will quickly discuss this reflex topic, which is important from the first prof point of view, because I have seen long questions being asked on this particular topic. So they ask to define reflex, classify reflexes, then draw a reflex arc. This is very commonly asked in all universities, this reflex arc, and properties of the reflexes. Right, let's therefore define reflex first. You know, when we touch a hot object, reflexly we would withdraw our limbs. Now keep this example in mind, because we will use this example again and again during this discussion. Touching a hot utensil or hot object, and we realize and immediately withdraw our limbs. So that's a reflex act, and therefore reflex is defined as involuntary response to a sudden adequate stimulus. So in this example, the sudden and adequate stimulus was touching on the hot object. That was the stimulus. And involuntary response was in the form of contraction of the hands or arms, limbs, and withdrawing away from the stimulus, right? So it has to be an involuntary response, yes, automatic response to a sudden stimulus and adequate stimulus. It should be an adequate stimulus so as to generate the response. There is one more way of looking at it. Reflex is a process by which a sensory input or sensory signal is automatically converted into a motor response without the involvement of higher centers or without the involvement of the cortex, without cortical involvement, right? Again, take the same example. When you touch a hot object, heat is the sensory input, and it got automatically converted into a motor response. Motor response was in the form of muscle contractions and withdrawing the limbs. But it did not involve the cortex. We don't think and then remove the limbs. It happens automatically. So at this stage, you should understand that the cortex means conscious involvement. Whenever we say cortex is involved, it is happening consciously. And when there is no cortical involvement, we will call it automatic response, involuntary response. So involuntary response to a sudden adequate stimulus, or a sensory input which is automatically converted into a motor response without the cortical involvement. I mean, take two examples. If you feel cold, then you make a conscious decision to reach out to the switch and switch off the AC. This is cortical involvement, conscious decision. That's not a reflex. But if you are touching this hot or cold object and suddenly withdrawing the limbs, that's a reflex act. Right, these are the definitions of a reflex. Basically, no cortex involved, cortex not involved. Okay, classification of the reflexes. reflexes can be classified in various ways. Let's make just a table so that we can quickly have a synopsis. How do we classify the reflexes? Anatomical classification is based on where the center is located. Based on this, the reflex can be either spinal reflexes or supraspinal reflexes. Okay, spinal reflex is this one, withdrawing the limbs when you touch the hot objects. It occurs at the spinal cord level. Or all those stretch reflexes, they are spinal reflexes. Knee jerk, ankle jerk, these are all spinal cord level reflexes. Supraspinal reflexes means center is above the spinal cord. Means let's say in the brain stem, that will be a supraspinal reflex. So pupillary light reflex, for example, or corneal reflex. When you touch the cornea or conjunctiva with a wisp of cotton, there is reflex blinking of the eyes. So there will be so no involvement of the cortex, but it is above the level of spinal cord, somewhere in the brainstem. That's supraspinal reflex. Another way of classifying the reflexes is based on functional classification. I mean, let's say physiological classification of reflexes. Means what function is subserved by this by particular reflex. Based on that, some reflexes are called as flexor or withdrawal reflexes, and the other ones are the extensor reflexes. Based on the function. Now, flexor withdrawal reflexes, again the same example. When you are when body is touched with some painful stimulus or heat or cold, extreme cold, then we flex the body part. See, this is the flexion of the limbs. Flex the body part and withdraw it from the stimulus. That's a flexor withdrawal reflex. Flexion of the body part so that you move that body part away from the stimulus. And the function therefore is, these are protective reflexes. Their function is to protect the body part. On the other hand, extensor reflexes, they are mostly the postural reflexes. To maintain the posture, the reflexes that we find are the postural reflexes. I mean, imagine that the neck is suddenly dropping and the neck extensors will contract and our head will be upright. So, body's posture, head upright and upright posture of the body is by the extensor contraction of the extensor muscles in a reflex manner. So, postural reflexes, to maintain the upright posture, they are extensor reflexes because they cause extensor muscles to contract in a reflex manner. Well, there is one more way of classifying the reflexes based on the number of synapses involved. Based on this, we see that there are basically two types of reflexes. One is the monosynaptic reflexes. Single synapse involved means only two neurons involved, one afferent neuron, one efferent neuron, and the synapse between the two. That's a monosynaptic reflex. All those jerks, knee jerk, bicep jerk, tricep jerk, they are the examples of monosynaptic reflexes. The other one is polysynaptic reflexes. Multiple synapses are there are also disynaptic reflexes. For example, a reflex initiated by Golgi tendon organ. We will see that in the muscle spindle and proprioceptors in the muscle. Let's include it anyways. Although there are very few examples of disynaptic reflexes, but nevertheless we can include them here. Disynaptic and oligosynaptic. Oligosynaptic means a few synapses involved. Oligo. Okay. Disynaptic reflexes. Reflex initiated by Golgi tendon organ. We will discuss this later. And polysynaptic reflexes. Multiple synapses are involved. All the pain reflexes initiated by the pain stimuli are generally the polysynaptic reflexes. Okay, so flexor withdrawal reflexes, or wherever there is painful stimulus involved, those are polysynaptic reflexes. Right, that's one more way of classifying the reflexes. Next is clinical classification of reflexes. Clinically, from which body part you are eliciting the reflex. Based on this, the reflexes can be superficial, deep, and visceral reflexes. Superficial reflex means the one which is elicited from the superficial part of the body, skin or cornea, corneal reflex, abdominal reflex. These are superficial reflexes. Second, deep reflexes, which are elicited from the deeper parts of the body like muscle and tendon. So, all the tendon jerks or tendon reflexes are the deep reflexes. Then third, visceral reflexes. The reflexes, for example, in the digestive tract, gastrocolic reflex. It's a visceral reflex, means upon eating food, there is bowel movement and a sensation of defecation immediately. That's a gastrocolic reflex. It's a visceral reflex. Gastrocolic reflex. And there is fourth category also, clinically speaking. Of course, when I said reflexes which are elicited from which part of the body, so superficial and deep, those reflexes are elicited as a clinician. Whenever you say clinical, it means as a clinician, how do you elicit it? That's a clinical thing. Superficial, deep is fine. Visceral reflexes cannot be elicited by a clinician because they are involuntary in nature and deep inside the body. Anyways, there is one more category, that is pathological reflexes. All the reflexes which I mentioned above are physiological reflexes. Pathological means which are pathologically present. So, for example, Babinski's sign, extensor plantar reflex, Babinski's sign, that's a pathological reflex. So, in the pyramidal tract lesion, you will see such a pathological reflex. Right. Finally, there is one more way of classifying the reflexes. Based on whether the reflex is present since birth in every individual, or whether it is acquired by each individual by their specific training and learning. So, based on that, the reflexes can be either innate reflexes, which is inborn, versus acquired reflexes. Innate or inborn reflexes are present in individuals since birth, in every individual. So, for example, cephalic phase of the gastric acid secretion, it's an innate reflex. Okay, let's write it here. Unconditioned reflex means for which there is no conditioning required, no training required. There was an MCQ like this. Upon seeing the food, a dog started salivating. Reflex salivation occurred in the dog. What type of reflex is that? Innate reflex, or conditioned reflex, or classical operant conditioning, or habituation. Most of the students wrote classical conditioning or conditioned reflex, which was a wrong answer, because they thought dog and food and reflex salivation, this is Pavlov's experiment, and therefore it was a classical conditioning, example of classical conditioning. No, when food is presented, there is reflex salivation. This is present in every dog, and in fact in every animal, every human being, and this is present since birth in every animal. So this is an innate reflex. Only when bell and food are paired, and upon ringing of bell there is reflex salivation in the dog, that will be the conditioned reflex. It came after training or conditioning. Okay, so unconditioned reflex means presentation of food causing reflex salivation. This does not require any conditioning, so it's called as unconditioned reflex. And the second type, of course, is conditioned reflex. This you can go on writing, half a page, because you know the experiment, Pavlov's experiment. I will write it in short, but if you are writing an answer in the exam, you can write half page on this. Pavlov's classical conditioning. And you know what it is. A dog is given food, there is reflex salivation. Then next, learning starts, training. First the bell is rung and then the food is given. Bell is rung, the food is given. Bell is rung and the food is given. After a few times like this, the next time, only upon ringing of bell, there was reflex salivation. Now this is present only in that particular specific animal. That specific animal learnt. It got conditioned, and therefore this is called as classical conditioning by Pavlov. So two types of reflexes, one which are present since birth in every individual, one which is acquired specifically by each individual. Okay, that's the table. I'm trying to just make it in a single screen. Anatomical classification, physiological classification based on the number of synapses, then clinical classification, and finally whether inborn or acquired.